My secret, just do something that ain't nobody ever done before, but make it sound like something that's always been there forever.
Welcome to This Filipino American Life, a podcast that explores the nuanced experiences of Filipinos in the United States at iba pa. I am Joe Bernardo, and I'm joined by my fellow hosts,
Ryan Carpio,
Elaine Delalis,
and
Mike.
Producer Mike.
And we also have
resident reality checker.
What? Who's that? Every time Girlie says something, I'd look at Joe's face just to see your reaction.
Is that your hip hop name?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if you heard it. This is for Joe.
Oh.
She is my reality checker, unfortunately.
That's her Wu-Tang name.
Happily.
Her Wu-Tang name.
Nandito pa si Mrs. Sterdring.
I totally thought you were going to go into the detail call. I was like, I'm going to be there.
No. But yeah, my parole officer is here. So welcome again to another episode of This Filipino American Life. We are here in the beautiful San Fernando Valley, recording in my living room.
Yes.
Yes. And we just had hot dogs for lunch.
Yes.
Yeah.
Shuttle hot
Shuttle
dogs.
dogs.
Yes. Shout out to Seattle. We
Flew
were just
all the way
there.
in from Seattle. The hot dogs did.
Boy, were their arms tired.
Whoa.
We were nostalgic for Seattle, so that's why I decided to make Seattle hot dogs, Seattle style hot dogs, which for those who don't know, you put cream cheese in the hot dog.
It's so good.
It's so good.
I can't.
It's good.
It's delicious.
Don't knock it till you try it.
What would the Filipino version of a hot dog be?
Hot dog silog
Oh.
with eggs and rice.
Yeah, Pure Foods.
Pure Foods?
Oh, the red one?
yeah.
The really, really red
glowing
hot dog?
Pinkish hot dog.
The one that you get on a stick with marshmallows usually?
Inside a pineapple.
Wow.
Dude, I have pictures from my 6th birthday with all of this thing, the thing you just said.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Elaine's seen it at our parties too.
Yeah, I
We've
didn't
had them at our parties.
understand.
It's like salty and then sweet.
Yeah.
We went to a Taiwanese place and their tapas was like sausage, Taiwanese sausage.
That's
and when you
great.
ate it, I literally was like, you can eat pancit sausage on its own without pancit as
Yeah.
an appetizer.
It's
I can just eat
delicious.
this.
Yeah, I think Chinese people do that.
We should do that.
I do. What? You don't do it. We do it.
Oh, you do?
I do it. Why not?
What, the Chinese sausage? Or?
Yeah, any
Yeah?
kind.
You
Yeah.
just
Stop.
Ryan does like a lot of sausage.
Easy there. Easy with the jokes. Okay.
So yeah, we have a few voicemails. Actually, first let's go with the TFAL of the episode.
Oh, yeah.
The TFAL of the episode is Sylvia Jimenez.
Sylvia, how are you?
Hey, Sylvia. I'm like linking.
Don't lie.
No, I'm like, do I know
Do you
Sylvia?
know
Jimenez?
Sylvia Jimenez?
Yeah. No.
Such a
Hi,
liar.
Sylvia.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for your support, Sylvia. Really appreciate it. If you want to be a TFAL episode, simply sign up to be a Patreon.
Yep.
For TFAL, sorry. And be a TFAL.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. And we also have a few voicemails, which I will play right now.
Hello, ako si Gilbert. I'd like to tell you that I like your show a lot and it is very entertaining and that I like the stories, especially that Ryan guy. Ryan is very funny. He's so funny that I think he's excellent. Okay, thank you a lot. Okay, bye-bye.
So Ryan, did you call?
I know.
I named myself Gilbert and gave myself a shout out. No, but thanks, Gilbert. I don't know who that is.
You're such a liar.
No, I seriously do not know who that is. I looked up the number and I don't know who it is.
Wow, so Ryan has fans.
I know.
No,
Gilbert.
fan, and his name is Gilbert.
Gilbert and Ernie.
All right, and we have another voicemail.
Hi, is this the Filipino American Life? I hope that you guys cover the Asian Pacific Los Angeles Filmmaker Festival. Anyways, try to bring some of the filmmakers on there, or musicians, or actors, or whoever. That would be kind of cool. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So by the time this airs, the film festival will be over.
Yes,
but we
that was like
are
a few months ago.
But
But it is happening right now as we're recording,
as
actually.
we
so-
record. And if you listen to episode 81, we actually talked to Francis Culato, the executive director of Visual Communications, which puts on the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival.
Yes. But yeah, if you don't, once you hear this, make sure to mark your calendars for next year to listen to or to watch the film festival.
Yes.
Yeah, it'll be great. And also, I want to shout out to the person who called from the 401 number. I think that's, where is that again? I think Pennsylvania somewhere. Your voicemail is a little too long, and so that's why we're not going to play it. But yeah, maybe you call again and re-record your voicemail, and we can play it on the radio.
Try to keep it under like 15 seconds.
What area code is it?
401.
Looks like Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, sorry, not Pennsylvania.
Neither a road nor an island, but a state. Rhode Island. You guys never heard this before?
I have not heard that.
Okay, thank you for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Oh
This is
my
why
God.
Gilbert loves me. Thank you, Gilbert.
We also have a text message from somebody who also asked about the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival. And they say that I work in television development department. That's cool. And they're Filipino American, and I'm looking to meet and connect with other Filipino filmmakers, writers, and creatives in the industry to encourage better representation. I'd love to go to an event to meet you all. Will you be doing a live episode? Thank you for what you're doing, Greg Cabrera.
All right, great.
We didn't do a live episode. Keep following us, and we may do one in 2019.
Yes.
Because people have been asking, and hopefully we can make it happen. But please be patient, because podcasting in front of a studio audience is a different thing.
I mean, we kind of did a live
did it.
one.
We kind of, with Cinema Sala.
Yeah, with
Yeah.
Marie Zamora.
with Marie Jamora.
Yeah.
Who he should probably get to meet.
Yeah, so hopefully we connect with you, Greg Cabrera.
Right on.
Yes. So now we're going to talk about Filipino ethnic enclaves.
Oh, what?
Yes, Filipino ethnic enclaves. Like Filipinotown. We have historic Filipinotown here in Los Angeles. There's Soma Pilipinas San Francisco. There's an effort to make Filipino village in National City. So ethnic enclaves, and or maybe the lack thereof in the Filipino community.
Oh, don't forget Little Manila.
Oh, Little Manila and Stockton, of
Stockton.
course, yes. But yeah, I guess there's like despite some of these these namings of Filipino districts, there's still a common narrative out there that Filipinos don't have an ethnic enclave, and we could get into kind of the reasons for that. So basically, Filipinos don't have, say, like a Chinatown or Japantown or Little India, etc. And so we're going to talk about why that is, why it's important or not important, the way Filipinos are kind of, I guess, geographically spread out, if you will, in the United States. Even with kind of heavy populated, Filipino populated cities like Daly City, Carson, Vallejo, Jersey City,
Panorama City.
Filipinos don't comprise the majority of those cities or neighborhoods, and arguably don't have kind of like a markedly Filipino kind of like an ethos or Filipino-ness to them, other than kind of the people who live there. So we're going to talk a little bit about it today in this episode. So my first question to all of you is, growing up, did you ever think of a Filipino town or Little Manila or anything like that?
No.
No.
You didn't think about that?
I already thought I kind of lived in one without knowing. And that's because the church I went to, St. Genevieve, was already super Filipino. And so I was like, I already live in one? That's more I came from.
Okay.
Yeah.
I kind of felt the same way. I mean, I grew up in Stockton, California, with a lot of Mexicanos, Filipinos. The majority of the people who attended my church were Filipino. There's a Filipino youth group. So it never felt like I needed like a specific neighborhood in my city. That was just the way it was.
Yeah, I didn't search it, or I didn't really, coming as immigrating from the Philippines. I never really searched it. I just thought of my city as Los Angeles, where I grew up, and being in America as being in America. Now, learning about other ethnic enclaves or even towns like Chinatown, that became more of like just an area that had a lot of Chinese businesses for me. That's where we went to eat. But I never really searched for like why did we not have a Filipino town during that time?
Mm-hmm.
Why did is it necessary to have one? I also grew up in an area where there's a lot of Latinos and Filipinos, so I didn't really miss seeing people of like faces. My church was kind of the same, so I didn't really search for it when I was a kid.
Mike?
I mean, I think because our family was really spread out, like we didn't have a lot of relatives around. Like it was normal for us to kind of go all over the place to kind of connect with folks. And so, and like inherently wherever those folks lived tended to be around like, oh, there's a Filipino bakery or a restaurant nearby. And so it's not like I ever felt like I needed to have that as a town. Cause I mean, obviously I was aware of a Chinatown, Little Tokyo, et cetera. But when I thought about like Filipino communities, like, well, my cousins in Long Beach who have a bake shop, or like, my auntie who has, well, actually the same auntie who has like a restaurant in what we now call historic Filipinotown. And even in Oxnard, the majority of the businesses were kind of all within the same kind of couple blocks on one street. And so it's kind of a de facto, But I also thought maybe mostly of just neighborhoods where Filipinos lived,
Right.
but not really thinking about it as a Filipino town. Like, oh, there's a lot of Filipinos in South Oxnard and College Estates or Lemonwood, but I wouldn't call them Filipino towns. It just so happened there were a lot of Filipinos that I knew of in those areas.
And it's kind of still the way we talk about it now, right?
Yeah, like Panorama City, Atwater,
Right.
those things.
We kind of know where they are, like the Filipinos are. Not even just Filipinos. We know like the other designations that came later on in our lives. We already knew, right? We already knew there was a certain group of people in this particular area before it was designated anything. So
For me growing up, I also didn't get any information as to why the Filipino Plaza existed, for example, in downtown Stockton, or why Chinatown existed. Like I didn't learn any of that until I moved away and went to San Francisco, to go to college. And that's when I started to learn how those neighborhoods came to be. But for us, like the Filipino Plaza was kind of like, that was the place where you could go. You knew that there was at least one restaurant there where you can get toro stuff. And there would be different Filipino groups meeting and folks who lived in the one, I don't even know how many stories this building was, but I know that there was a lot of older Filipino men who lived in that building. And yeah, that it was just kind of like, this is what Stockton is. And there was no context to me.
You know what's funny though? I do look for Chinatowns in different big cities.
When you go to different cities?
Yeah. I don't know why. I mean, like as an adult, I'm like, oh, I wonder if they have a Chinatown area. Right?
Because you want cheap food. That's why.
Partly, but also like, what's interesting is like there is that I don't know if it's me just trying to look for a connection to maybe a larger API community, because I know, like I already know if I'm in Washington DC, I doubt there's a Filipino town here, but I wonder if there's a Chinatown. Like I always look for that, because
there's that one block now.
One block,
which right, it's like the arch and then like one block, right? But I think in Seattle I even said, hey, there's a Chinatown here, right? We're gonna go to Chinatown.
There's a Chinatown in Mexico City.
Yeah. See, so like in just there's definitely something there. Maybe it's a brand, right? Like that you kind of look for. But I'm curious to know if you ever thought about it, Joe.
So I totally had opposite, because I grew up in like I went to high school in like a pretty predominantly white place, and like all those Asians kind of hung out with each other, and then but I was like only Filipino, and so I had a lot of Korean, Japanese, Chinese friends, and they always talk about like their certain towns, or like they're like, oh, we're gonna go to K-Town, or we're gonna hang out there tonight, or something like that, or let's go get sushi at like a little Tokyo. So it was always in my mind, thinking like, why isn't there no like Filipino town, right? And I knew there's like certain concentrations, like Panorama City, for example, and Carson, West Covina, Cerritos, etc. But it wasn't, when you go there, it's kind of like, okay, there are a lot of Filipinos here, but there's not like a how do you say it? Like
Identifier?
It's not a very visible Filipino space.
Right.
It's very like you kind of have to be in the know to know about it, right?
Right.
So anyways, so I kind of grew up thinking about like, oh, what would a Filipino town look like? That would be kind of cool. And so this is kind of embarrassing, but I drew this little map in high school. And so
I can't wait for y'all to
Oh my
hear
God.
this.
I can't
Hey guys,
wait
listen
to see
to
this
this
on
map,
the web.
guys.
This means he's been saving it since high school.
Oh my goodness.
maybe I'll post it when I'll post a
should
picture of it.
post
Yeah, this needs to be on the web.
So basically, this is when I
Take a picture. Of
This is when I came back from the Philippines, and I became like, well, I didn't become, but I was already politicized back then. But what?
So I was already thinking, I'm like, it's gonna be an area for sabong. And Joe has a little thing there. Anyway,
Wait, so this image is your vision of
It was,
a
yeah. When I was in high school, I was
Filipinotown.
like, okay, so what Filipino what Filipino like cultural aspects can I include, and what would it look like if it was like organized in a specific
streets.
neighborhood?
Chinela basketball.
The streets there. Jose Rizal Boulevard, Lapu Lapu Lane, Emilio Aguinaldo Boulevard.
Oh, that's before I really know the history of Emilio Aguinaldo.
yeah.
Rojas Boulevard.
Now what?
Oh my God, we have to scan this. I'll take a picture though. Like that's just amazing.
So, anyways, so I did a little map when I was like 15 years old.
Yeah. And you also city planned it like you would in Metro Manila.
I know.
Like all crammed.
like, why is it so
There's a
tight?
roundabout in the middle.
Yeah, exactly. Like how usually is.
What is a euphoria club?
Oh, you don't want to know, girly.
Because Euphoria was like the hot nightclub way back in the day.
Oh, okay.
That's not what you told me.
All right, so listeners, I apologize. This is all visual right here. I'm just
Wow.
basically this little.
We have to
map.
put that map on.
There's a Fernando Amorsolo Art Museum.
Oh, my
You were
goodness.
even thoughtful about that. Wow.
Yeah, see, we were destined for each other, girly.
Oh God, yeah.
So this is like a pre-Burning Man, everyone. So imagine the city existing, popping up.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, you put Tatak Filipino on here.
Tatak Filipino, if you want to sponsor us.
Filipinas Magazine,
Yeah, when they were still around.
rest in peace, is on here too. Wow.
Johnny Air Cargo is on there. There's still Johnny Air Cargo.
Yeah. So
Oh
I
my
took
God.
like also existing Filipino businesses and like
It's hilarious.
I placed. So I was like 15 or 16 when I did that. Anyways, so it's been in my mind for a long time.
Clearly.
Clearly,
Yeah.
And it's also partly because I didn't grow up in a very Filipino neighborhood.
Yeah.
And there was kind of this brewing nationalism that grew me when I was in high school, and that's how I became politicized. But yeah, so Filipino
Asian car show.
He was 15.
So political.
15, Mike.
I was 15, dude. Come on.
Of course.
Come on.
Joe's hot import nights.
So wait, so who's seen this? Like, was this ever a discussion amongst your Asian fans?
Actually, I'm only you guys and Roland.
Really?
my friend Roland, who is the CEO of Kumu app. Download it now. But yeah,
No, seriously, download it.
so I have thought of this for a long time, and and then I basically studied this, and I learned about like why Filipino towns don't exist, And basically, they don't exist because Filipinos do, by and large, when they come here, they speak English, so they're not dependent on an ethnic economy, and they're able to get jobs and buy houses anywhere they want. I mean, relatively, they can't get really at rich areas, but fairly working class to middle class neighborhoods. That's where a lot of Filipinos are, and so a lot of them are scattered around, and that's kind of the common explanations. But I also think that it's because a lot of our culture is not othered as much. So, for example, like we're Catholic, so we're more or less, we don't establish a lot of independent Filipino churches. There might be a few here and there. And also, like, our businesses that do exist, a lot of their signage is in English, right? So when you go to, like, West Covina or Eagle Rock or something, like, a lot of their signage are in English, and people who don't know that this is a specific Filipino business won't really understand, or they don't see that kind of otherness. And I was always thinking also, like, if we still kept buying, like, how would that look like in the kind of physical infrastructure, physical landscape?
Oh, like the signage would look like
would look
Koreatown,
different, right? It would look different. We would be othered, and then othering, kind of in this kind of context, means that we are more quote unquote visible. Right. Yeah. So. So yeah, when we're thinking about ethnic enclaves, what do we expect in one? Like Ryan talked about, like, is it like a church, a business, social, like, what exactly
a
do we look
marker
for?
that says that you've entered a different neighborhood.
Okay.
Like a gateway.
Yeah.
So like a sign, right?
Yeah.
Sign.
Yeah. Okay. What else?
Market is my go-to.
Like some kind of
supermarket.
economy, right?
Yeah.
And when you say supermarket, like that caters to that population, that community?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like in Echo Park Silver Lake Echo Park, like the A Foods market was for the longest time, like it was the Asian market to go to for years. And then it shut down and it was like, oh, it's gone. Like that identity attached to the neighborhood. Yeah. And I think that market was like Chinese, Vietnamese owned. But like the Filipinos who lived in the neighborhood, we all would that's where they would go originally before the Seafood City opened up, before the Island Pacific opened up.
When we went to Waipahu, me and Gurley, when we went to Waipahu, Hawaii, Waipahu actually has the highest concentration of Filipinos anywhere in the United States. It's about like 55% Filipino.
Whoa.
And when you go there, it actually, some places you actually feel like you're in the Philippines.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the houses have those mini Filipino columns.
Everybody has the same mold.
Yeah.
Columns?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's this kind.
It's hard to describe.
We'll probably post
picture of it.
Yeah, let's post a picture of it. But it's kind of this wavy.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. But it's like a concrete fence.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
then it's like
it's made out of concrete.
Yeah.
Like my dad, I don't know how many trips ago, but he came back with the actual mold. So he created
could do that.
Yeah. So he created these and put them in front of in our house in Stockton.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So they're like a little wall, but
Yeah.
And then when you go to Waipahu, there's actually like I guess there's an election going on, and all the election signs look like the ones in the Philippines.
Oh, with their picture and then like the vote for so and so.
Yes, and it has like the same font and the same kind of color scheme.
It's a vinyl sign.
Yeah. It looks exactly like the ones in the Philippines. So
Whoa.
yeah.
And for me, like we went to, of course, Joe wanted to go to Seafood City, and just walking around, I was unprepared by how much Ilocano we heard.
Yeah.
I mean, it totally felt like I was back in the Philippines.
Yeah. Okay, so next question is, do you think having a specific Filipino ethnic enclave is necessary? We talked about having neighborhoods or cities that have high concentration of Filipinos, but what about actual kind of like historic Filipinotown or Soma Pilipinas or Little Manila? Do you think those are necessary? Why or why not?
Okay, so I want to take a little step back for a second on what an enclave is versus like a designation, right? Like a designation of an area. Because I think naturally, if you're an immigrant coming into this country, what you look for is an area where there are people who look like you, who can support you, who can you have maybe the same foods as you are, same businesses, etc. So maybe the enclave exists outside. Maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but maybe it exists outside of the naming of a neighborhood. Like we know where the Filipino enclaves are without it being called a Filipino town or anything like that, particularly because of who the people are that are there. So that's where your church is. That's where your business, that's where the Filipino market is, because they recognize that there's a lot of Filipinos in a particular area. So there's really the support system. So for an enclave to kind of exist in an area, it's like there's a system that already kind of exists. Now, the question of whether we think it's important to have a certain designation of it, I don't think so. I don't think it's that important to necessarily say or designate something based on who's living there. I don't think it's that necessary, particularly because when I look at historic Filipinotown, I don't see a lot of Filipinos that necessarily live there. When I look at Koreatown, I don't see a lot of Koreans that actually live there. Right, Los Angeles, Koreatown. There's a lot of Korean businesses there. So the designation of it is somewhat a little bit, I don't know, for me it's a little bit misplaced maybe. I think the important part of it is something we talked about in the past where you're looking for like political power or being recognized. But outside of that, I don't think the enclave requires you to have the designation, if that makes sense.
I agree. I mean, I think oftentimes the power is more associated with the economic and political aspect of it. Because, I mean, I even think about areas like Little India in Artesia, California. I mean, the reason, for me, visibly, the reason why it's called that is because it is, I don't know, like maybe 3 or 4 blocks full of like specific
Indian businesses.
Specific businesses. And I think about Koreatown in Los Angeles, and so many Korean-owned businesses, even though Koreans are not the majority of the population there.
Elaine, Mike?
I mean, it's interesting for us because we live in Filipinotown, right? And when I was talking about my aunt who owned a business in what is now Filipinotown, I mean, it was like on Temple Street, and we would go there, and it was just like, I didn't think about like, are we like in a Filipino neighborhood? But now that we live there and we've been there for the last 10 years or so, I mean, even this morning before we recorded, I walked down like a block to Bagnet to get some, tapsilog, and like walked by the Pinay Laundry and like, and I can hear Tagalog kind of being, spoken on the stoops of people's houses as walking around. So, I mean, there's this element of like, there was or is an enclave, like in that kind of natural way that you're identifying. And then there's also like the designation that kind of came on top of that, but also recognizing that like the Filipino community that might have been there, that was there, has also kind of moved and transitioned and migrated. And so kind of like, and I mean, we've had this discussion before, and like about like historic Filipinotown versus Filipinotown versus like all these other things. I think like it identifies something that kind of exists in some parts and is still there, and that I feel as a neighborhood, like someone in the neighborhood. What it brings to the neighborhood on top of that is, kind of depends on like if you have a business or not, I guess. But at the end of the day, I think like it maybe like Filipinos just never felt like they needed an enclave necessarily, because like our familial ties are like probably more stronger than like our community ones. This is just my theory right now. And if I think about like my migration story and like how we built community, it wasn't about location, it was about people, wherever that location was. We didn't try to find other Filipinos, we just knew the Filipinos that we knew and stayed connected with them.
I also think about how places like Chinatowns were created. I mean, they were created to isolate Chinese immigrants, right?
Redlining and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think Filipinos necessarily had the same experience I mean,
No.
there were laws that prevented them from owning property and land. But not, I don't know, like you can correct me, Joe, but I don't think to the same extent as Chinese immigrants.
So I guess economically, or like in people's everyday lives, I would say like they aren't necessary because Filipinos have more or less have survived in America since then. But in terms of kind of political advancement,
Right.
I think they're necessary. That's just kind of my opinion. We actually got the opinions, or we asked the questions to some of our Patreons out there.
Ooh, what'd they say?
Yeah. So Caroline, I forgot where she's from, but she says ethnic enclaves are necessary, and I say this because based on the belief that enclaves are not created accidentally. They exist because Filipinos needed a space to both cope with socio-political conditions they experienced. They also exist for Filipinos to thrive, to participate in local economies, to bring a piece of their homeland to places abroad. And I'm paraphrasing, and I'm not saying the whole thing, but she's also kind of, I guess, active or studying Soma in San Francisco, and she said like people advocating for Soma Pilipinas face the challenges of competing agendas focused on economic development, arguably gentrification, that doesn't necessarily include Filipinos. So the creation of and preservation of enclaves isn't just about concentration of ethnic groups, it's about supporting small businesses, improving education infrastructure, and Filipinos are entitled to culturally competent and responsive services. So in a sense, she's also saying that like, yes, it's necessary because that's also a way, like designating an ethnic enclave is a way to thwart or kind of resist gentrification. What do y'all think of that?
I don't know if anyone really has thought of it that deeply. I think it's a lot more organic depending on what you're talking about. There's, I mean, the balance between the deliberateness of a community and the realities of why the community exists.
Right.
To what your point, Girly.
Right.
And I don't know. I can go both ways on that.
Yeah, because a lot of these communities, I don't want to say a lot because that's generalizing, but for the most part, I think enclaves existed because communities came together because they didn't have family and they didn't know each other. Right. And so like that's how Chinatowns exist because of like bachelor societies. And so they came together. And so that's how the Chinatowns happened.
Well, they were also excluded from living in certain
that as well.
areas.
However, a lot of the migration for current Filipinos has always been family and family related. So like the need to come together that other ethnicities have had, like the circumstances define communities differently. And like in Mike's situation, like it's interesting because in the Navy, all the Filipinos come together and they created a family of their own. So they create that system.
And it wasn't necessarily geographic.
It's not geographic. It was just a matter of like you're coming together because they were all in this space.
Yeah. I mean, there's like even when I think about it too, 'cause there's a lot of like organizations, like fraternal, whatever kind of organizations. Like I think the one for the Navy folks in Ventura County was like Pinoys, something humans, something whatever.
They're all like Masons.
I don't remember.
something, etc.
Yeah. But I mean, like that was like, all the people who were part of those kind of things, not everyone was like a neighbor or like in the same kind of geographic slice of Oxnard. I mean, it was kind of like different parts of Ventura County. And again, like there were like some of the places that existed in what was kind of a de facto Filipinotown Oxnard was like a barbershop, Forex / LBC shipping thing, mini marts and etc. Stuff that kind of like, and like, a tailor. I mean, some of it was like serving kind of the early Filipino military kind of like needs. But yeah, I mean, those existed, but that didn't mean that like the community was around it. I mean, even like if you think about concentrations of Filipinos in Oxnard versus where this de facto Manilatown existed, was like totally separate places.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like just like a mix of opportunity, of like reality, of like what was available, and so there's a lot less organization or forced organization to it, really.
Yeah.
I also think there's like this hierarchy of kind of like a hierarchy of your current needs, right? Like I think enclaves certainly evolve, whereas you may have started something in a neighborhood because you needed some kind of support system. But as that grows, like in that question of whether or not it's going to impact gentrification later if you didn't have it designated, yeah, there's definitely truths in that because of how it evolves. But enclaves, I don't think, outside of like being redlined or out, but those that grow naturally, you don't necessarily look for the political power quite yet, right? Your initial thought is like surviving, an immigrant survival tactic of like making sure that you had people that you can count on. Now, as that evolves, maybe the desire for that enclave is to, hey, we want to be listened to, and I think that's what we're currently kind of growing into now. With the designation of Los Angeles as a historic Filipino town in the early 2000s, for example. There was an evolved need to make sure that we got paid attention to. I think that's very different from the beginning of the enclave. I think that's kind of like where you start realizing your political growth and power and being integrated into the landscape that you're currently in. So it's definitely like an evolution thing to me. Like I think we as a people and as immigrant population have the ability to look towards that. But in terms of like the origins of an enclave, I don't think that's necessarily what we look for right away. We just want to thrive, right? We just want to thrive first.
I do think that like historic Filipinotown and the importance of its designation is there because of the political power, but also like historic Filipinotown, the center of it, right? It's in the center of LA. It's like in downtown LA. It almost feels like it was your port of entry into Los Angeles. Like a lot of people that I've spoken with, they have ties to historic Filipinotown. Like my parents first moved here. We lived in an apartment off Temple Street, right? So it's like their early years were there. And then when they got on their feet and had some economic stability, they were able to move out of that apartment and then like into a home. But the home wasn't in historic Filipinotown. It was in the San Fernando Valley, or it was in the San Gabriel Valley. Like they had to move out to afford the 2-bedroom house with a lawn and a garage, because those things weren't afforded to them. And so it's almost like ethnic enclaves are good. They're good starting points before you have economic stability. And then like the communities that get to stay, or the folks who choose to stay, it's almost like they had the ability to like buy a craftsman home in historic Filipinotown.
So why are these designations so important then? Like if the community is everywhere and elsewhere, and the point of survival is not necessarily like within the enclave, or has kind of passed, why do we still? Why is there a need for the designation? A Filipino, like having a historic Filipino town.
I go back to the whole idea around economic and political power. Having a designated enclave is a visual recognition of the contributions, the sacrifices that Filipinos and other immigrant groups have contributed to a specific region. Like that, my head goes there first because, again, in Lainey's example of her parents, economics drove them out of historic Filipinotown. Like in their heads, they wanted to own property and they wanted a specific lifestyle that was not afforded to them in historic Filipinotown. But ultimately, they still contributed to the development of that neighborhood at some point.
Others?
So to me, it's kind of like I agree with what Girly was saying. I think the success, what I consider like a successful designation, is the ones where investment comes back into that neighborhood, right? Remember, I'm not saying the success of an enclave necessarily. What I'm saying is the success of an area that's been designated a certain, a Chinatown, a Koreatown, a Little Tokyo, right, or a historic Filipino town. And I think that when you designate an area something, what your hope is that it's memorialized and it's not forgotten politically. But not only that, you hope that that space is created as an opportunity for folks within that community to invest back into it, whether it be through property or through business. Girlie was talking earlier about like these little designations of areas in Los Angeles. There's a ton of them, right? There's Little Bangladesh, which is like maybe a couple blocks.
Yep.
But there's a few businesses out there, and that's really the root of that designation. The root of their designation is making sure that there's a space to have an economic, a way to economically thrive in an area, or an investment in that area. So when you have investment in the area, I think it kind of goes hand in hand with your political influence. So that's the important part of the designation for me. It's not the important part of the what we were talking about earlier of the support system, right? Of people who are coming in here. It's more about like the aftermath of that. Like, now that we're here, what can we do to make it thrive? And then on the flip side, or the complete end of the other spectrum of that, is Koreatown. My goodness, if you have been to Koreatown in Los Angeles, it has changed in the last 30 minutes. There's like new businesses like popping up.
There's probably a high rise that just came up right now.
Just right now, while we were talking about this. But even though the residences aren't there, the investment is there. Like a large amount of investment, and with that comes a large amount of political, power with the city.
I do think that it's important to have the designation, because like for the person that doesn't have that, like if I'm somebody that grew up in like Wyoming and I only know like the 4 or 5 families that right? It feels like even in your experience, like in Calabasas, right? Like you only had Asian friends, so it's like you're trying to find yourself in the community, like in the space. Like your friends get to say, "I'm going to K-Town, I'm going to Little Tokyo," but what do you get to say, right? There's a feeling of something's missing, and so these ethnic enclaves, the gateways, the designation, it's almost like. It's like we're attempting to like put a flag in the sand and like stake claim that like I have a right to hold space in this city, and you can't erase my people, the context of us being here, and all of that. I think that's a level of importance that I think communities of color have been trying to find, in the importance of ethnic enclaves. Like in Los Angeles, I know we talk about LA so specific. I'm so sorry to fans who are not from LA, but like in this area, like there's been a resurgence of folks acknowledging that like the city is on Tongva land, and Tongva is the indigenous Indian community that the land was taken from. And I feel like that is a new phenomenon that I have heard people do in the past 5 years. And it's almost like that community, they're the original people here. They're still trying to make their claims to this city. And so if the original community of people are still trying to make claims to what is rightfully their land, communities of color who have found their space, like it's no wonder we're always trying to designate that we are here. Because holding space is such a I feel like it's such a foreign luxury, because in this country we've all been pushed and pulled displaced, and it's like you almost think you're not allowed to have the space. So by putting the archway by the gateway, it's like, no, like, bro, I'm here, I'm staying here, I'm not going anywhere. You can have my halo halo from the Jollibee drive-thru if you want, which is technically in Koreatown, not Filipinotown. But like this is us, this is here. We're here, we're queer, we're not going anywhere. That type of thing. I don't know.
We don't want any more barriers.
I would say that, I agree with all those things. The other thing, though, is that what you've laid out is a philosophy and a belief system that is very generational and migratory status specific. Like my parents would not give a shit. They don't care.
Yeah.
They just want to
Yeah.
know where
Right.
the seafood city is,
It's
right?
a hierarchy
Yeah.
of
They don't care.
I don't care what neighborhood
You know?
they're in.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I don't.
They just want to thrive or
they
survive.
They'd be even like, well, I mean, are they from Iloilo? Like, will I care about them if they're not? You know, that kind of thing. Like, literally, like, this is kind of their mindset. Is like,
Yeah.
well, if the moment I say like, oh, they're from like Antique, it's like, oh, I might have a cousin there. That might be my cousin, kind of thing, right? But if I'm like, oh, they're just like some people from Manila, it's like, oh, I don't hang out with those Manila people, you know, kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like, literally.
Right.
So I mean, like the thing that you've identified is very specific to like a subset of all of us, and so if you're talking about like mass organizing and mass groundswell around the idea of that level of values being kind of universal, I mean, clearly it's not. So I mean that's why I think it's harder for people to kind of rally around kind of the ideas of these things sometimes, because it's just like, well, those are a different set of values from what I have.
Yeah.
Well,
definitely.
and I think there has to be a level of intentionality once the designation does happen, because I see it now in historic Filipinotown in Los Angeles. Like, there's not really one like central community gathering space over the years. I mean, you know, maybe earlier in its designation or there were spaces for that, but right now there isn't. It's more like there's little spots here and there, like Unidad Park where the big mural is, but there's also not a lot of like huge businesses coming into the neighborhood. There's been smaller ones such as Geneva and Hi-Fi Kitchen. But, you know, in terms of having this kind of like huge recognition of businesses coming in, that hasn't really happened.
Right.
Yeah, it almost feels like folks, it's like a validation. It's like capitalism is validation, right? Like
Yeah, in
if you
some
have a
respects,
major
yeah.
department store or grocery store in your neighborhood, it signifies that like you've quote unquote made it, you know? But like businesses like Seafood City and whatnot, they're not going to go in historic Filipinotown because there wasn't zoned areas for that.
Right. The
Right?
space is not,
It's not-
appropriate for
yeah.
the size that they need.
And I think to Mike's point about like different segments of the community either wanting it or rejecting like a Filipino enclave. I remember my like an uncle of mine when historic Filipinotown first got designated, and then he said, "Historic Filipinotown is there? They should just bulldoze everything there. It's there's nothing there."
Oh man.
I was like, "Oh, okay."
You're like, thanks for shitting on my work.
So there's definitely a class aspect to it, right?
Sure.
And also, I remember my other uncle, or my aunt in Fremont, when I was telling her about Soma Pilipinas, she goes, "Why do I want to go there? There's no parking."
Yeah.
There you go.
It is totally like a generational mindset.
Yeah,
And like,
yeah.
I always think of it like it's really like it is class related.
Yeah.
Because like it's almost like generationally for us, right? Like if you live in LA, like our parents view living in the city of LA proper, why would you live there? You're poor.
Yeah.
Because if you live in the San Fernando Valley, you're able to afford a single family home and all these things, and like that's some like economic. That's a class thing. Like
Yeah,
you are middle class if you're able to live in a suburb,
Yeah, in a
Right.
house,
in a
car,
house, and all this stuff.
Right.
Unless you're like super rich, and if you're super rich, you can afford a McMansion in Beverly Hills or whatever those things are, or you buy like bigger property in like Simi Valley, which is like you move further away
Right.
from the community, the ethnic enclave. So I don't know if that is a Filipino specific thing where we like to move out of the city center because it shows your economic prowess, your class.
I think so.
Yeah.
Home ownership is definitely like a class thing, and it's embedded within the tax code here in the United States.
Right.
Right. It's more economical to buy a house.
Yeah.
Right. And it's been like that for like decades. Right. And it's
Yeah.
also the same way in the Philippines too. Like if you go to Manila, it's very car centric, you know, because everybody wants their own house. Nobody really wants to live in like in apartments and stuff like that, and take public transit. Most middle class Filipinos. and
Like
stuff,
their
so.
dream is to not live in Manila City proper in
It's,
a
yeah, it's to own have a
to own
house
a
and
house.
lot. House and lot.
House
house
and
and
lot.
lot.
Yeah.
Not just a house.
So
Yeah.
that could also then that mentality in the Philippines is what it's like it comes over to America
It's
then.
translated, yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's what's been articulated.
Yeah.
It is though very city specific though, right? Because if you're living in like Missouri or Arkansas, I'm sure you're like anybody can afford a home there or something because it costs like I could afford a home there, right? Or
We
Yeah.
could have our own block.
probably, but we'd be in the middle of nowhere, and
Yeah.
that would be the
Your block roaster would just be you. Like, where's house is going to? Elaine's next house. Elaine's.
House grocery.
house grocery.
So yeah, just a few other comments from some of our Patreons. Steve from Boston, he said, he was talking about growing up in Indiana and how his father helped sponsor all his relatives to move to where they were in their city, in Indiana. And he says that eventually this became our own, quote, Filipino enclave with a tight-knit group of physician families and relatives who celebrated holidays together. Lechon pig roast in July. Did bowling leagues together, attended each other's parties, weddings, and christenings. And then he goes on to say, however, as a community of Filipino Americans, I don't think our future political, cultural, financial, or social impact is necessarily rooted in self-segregation. So, question for you all. Do you think enclaves in general or Filipino enclaves propagate segregation?
I don't want to use that word because it has a very specific connotation to me in that it's separation that's being placed upon a group of folks.
Like, this is almost like we gotta find a way to connect with people,
Right. Whereas we've talked about Filipinos choosing to be near each other because they're either related or, of other reasons. But the fact that they are choosing to me is not segregation per se. It's more of like wanting to find that sort of connection, that community.
Cool.
Do you think, I'm sorry, I'm answering your question with a question, but on the flip side to that, do you think integration is important for an immigrant group to come to the States? And
and like
immigrate?
acculturation.
Yeah. In the picture of America that we sell to ourselves into like the American dream, the picture is like it's really diverse. You've got a United Colors of Benetton type neighborhood situation.
Yeah.
That is the picture that America sells. The reality is that's not what happens. Neighborhoods happen the way they happen through ethnic enclaves and whatnot, and
Either self-imposed
or
by force.
Yeah. Like because of what your wallet can afford you is where you're gonna live. That being said, LA is unique in that anybody can live anywhere, right? But it's just
Kind of.
No, we're still in the midst of the transition out of redlining, right?
Oh.
And then we're also redlining resulting in the economic kind of divisions that we now exist within, which then is also kind of painted by the racial segregation that was kind of economically driven, right? So you could theoretically live wherever, but whether or not you would be accepted into the community, whether or not you would be able to or
Or
there's
afford the things, yeah.
and-
that's the thing that Mike pointed
yeah.
out, whether or not you'd be accepted into the community. That I think is the linchpin to the conversation.
because it's also like are you a gentrifier or are you
Or
a
you're
neighbor?
not.
You know what I mean? That's
'Cause-
kind of a
So Mike and I have lived in historic Filipinotown since 2007. And even when we moved there, I actually asked the question, are we gentrifying this neighborhood? Because we were young professionals and well, even when we were in grad school, you know what I mean? Like we weren't of the neighborhood technically. Like I had come from the San Fernando Valley, Mike was from Oxnard. Were we gentrifiers? And it's a question that I've asked myself before, but then it's like I don't personally think I am because I don't have any money to put.
You don't have enough power to change that neighborhood.
I don't.
No, but I'm just saying, we kind of talked about the gentrification episode, but whether you can control it or not, you can't control property values, right? So if
Right.
Yeah, because I'm renting. I don't own it.
yeah, well, not just that, but like if more of you, like say, like it became more of a second generation Filipino professional class moving into historic Filipinotown, even though we're not white, do we raise property value because we do that? Maybe. So it's something you can't really control. If you are poor, working class, Latino, immigrant Filipino family, does that drop property value rates?
Yeah.
Perhaps, maybe. So it's a lot of forces that you can't control, like in terms of like property value. And
Do you
You
and Mike
know.
have a pet?
No.
Do you walk your pet around the Then you're not gentrifiers.
We don't have a fence that's like sideways instead of up down.
But
Hipster fences.
Gentra fences.
gentra fences. That's what Mike and I call them.
oh, I never heard that.
Gentra fence.
fences.
For folks who want to know what gentra fence is, it is a horizontal fence with a little bit of like maybe like half an inch gap between slats, and then Art Deco numbers to signify that is a gentra fence.
Sounds like a wall to me.
So before we end, I also want to get Clement. He wrote in and he said that if Filipino ethnic enclaves existed, Filipino Americans would have cornerstones from which to develop their experiences as Americans of Filipino heritage. I would say it would never be enough with respect to the question on current geographies. We can always be refining and reinforcing our identities as a Filipino American community. So it kind of goes into our conversation really about like it's not necessarily necessary for survival, but they are necessary for, I guess, political empowerment, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With a lot of intentionality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a complicated issue. We're not monolith like we always like to say in this podcast. Some people don't care for ethnic enclaves, and some people do. And
I think it's
We'll
also
see.
like, I think folks just want to live with people they know and feel safe around.
Right.
Because like for a while there's a Facebook article that was going around how like groups of friends are just buying like cul-de-sacs and living in a community together.
Yeah.
And like all of us were like, yeah, we should totally buy like one street. We all have the house together, because then we could just be like walk down the street and we would have our friends with us.
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of like my personal enclave. That's what I would want, right?
Yeah,
Like if
yeah.
we all lived near each other
That'd be cool.
in a neighborhood, it'd be like, oh, I could like walk over to Girlie's and borrow like sugar or whatever it is,
Or
something.
bogoong.
And then Joe could come over for coffee, because we would probably have coffee, because there's no coffee in this house ever. But,
Ever.
well, why would I go there? I don't even drink coffee.
You
Well,
were
when you
asking
asked
for coffee an hour ago.
Because I was getting sleepy.
or if I wanted to play poker, I know that I could just walk to Ryan's house and a game would be happening in his garage.
Yep, that's right.
And you could just poke him.
I think that's what I personally want that more than a Filipino one, but that's the luxury of the fact that I live in historic Filipino town.
So I think ultimately it's about like creating community, having community space, and claiming a space where you're always trying to, in an environment where you feel kind of invisible, right?
Yes.
So
Right.
I think that's the importance of it. Any other last thoughts?
I wish I had won the lotto. Because if I won the lotto, guys, I would totally buy like a city for all of us to live in.
That's how it works.
I don't know. Maybe.
I'll call it Seafood City.
Oh my god.
Oh my God.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening in. Tune in next time when we talk about something else.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
Just be quiet.
This Filipino American Life is produced by Michael Nailat. Our intro and outro music is by Roger Habon, aka 10.4 Raj. Resident reality checker Girlie Collado, legal advisor Rianne Fajardo, and graphic design by Vincent Collyer.